Wonderful. Well, we're really excited for everyone to be here. I know many of you, but for those I haven't met, my name is Lydia. I am with the Emmaus House Catholic Worker in Chicago, although I currently live part-time in Dubuque, Iowa, but right now am back at Emmaus in Chicago. So I'll be framing a little bit of the conversation we're going to have today. And then we'll have Brian come and share a little bit. But we want to thank you all for coming. This is a tricky conversation, one that there was a lot of interest in having, and that everybody has acknowledged is really important for our movement to have, and also one where as we started to think about how do we have this conversation, it was tough of so many important things to try to figure out, and how can we do that in a way that both sort of gives enough weight and time and space to address some of these heavy manners, and to be able to have that conversation in a way that is respectful to people, and in ways that we can hold people with some semblance of emotional safety, and recognizing that these are difficult things to work through. So we want to start off by really recognizing that today, with myself and Brian, we don't really come close at all to representing the viewpoints of various Catholic workers. We have such a wide diversity of religious and faith standpoints within the worker, from traditional Roman Catholics to practicing Catholics, to those who maybe are no longer practicing, but would still identify as Catholic, or Protestants, or those who have maybe left institutionalized churches at all, and those of other faith backgrounds, or those who maybe are unsure of where they're going to land. And so we want to recognize that some people may not feel like, in this initial framing and what Brian is sharing, that their views are covered. And so we just want to acknowledge that up front, that it's not our intent to marginalize views. And it is not our intent to sort of incorrectly portray a view that maybe is not as well known or well followed within the worker. But we simply could not find a way to give enough space to cover all things. We also want to ask that people come into the discussion knowing that while we believe that we're all coming from places of love, that even if we're coming from places of love, careless words can be very hurtful, and cause real harm. There's also sort of the phenomenon that oftentimes in these sorts of discussions, it's the people with marginalized identities who end up bearing the brunt of the emotional burden of this work in difficult discussions. With it sort of being normative that we accept the dominant or understood viewpoint, and sort of expect people with marginalized identities to be understanding of the dominant viewpoint. So we want to recognize, to be sensitive to that, and to be sensitive on who we're placing that emotional burden on during our discussions. We also want to be particularly mindful of the ways that the Catholic Church and Christianity in general has really harmed people, has really harmed women, has really harmed people of color, the LGBTQ community. And so to this end, we also want to recognize and give space that if you are someone who is coming to this discussion who has been harmed by the church, and maybe you're entering in wanting to fully participate, and we get into the breakout rooms and things are just bringing up old or current wounds, we want to give space for that. And so we are going to designate sort of a breakout room for people to just be able to hang out. If things are just feeling maybe too overwhelming, you can go back to the main session and Matt will manually direct you into a breakout room where I'll be spending time. And so people are more than welcome to just come hang out there, talk, don't talk if you don't want to. But just a space where we wanted people to still be able to participate and come back to the share back session. But unlike a physical meeting where maybe if somebody needed a break, they could walk out of the room for a few minutes, it's harder to do that with Zoom, and we don't want anyone to have to leave the meeting if, for whatever reason, participation just isn't going to be healthy in that moment. So essentially, initially, this was supposed to be all I was going to sort of do, frame things. Then we were going to turn it over to some presenters. We were going to share their wisdom, and we were going to go into some breakout rooms. But at the last moment, one of our presenters fell through. And so I've been asked to kind of fill in some additional thoughts. Many of you who know me know that I am not Catholic. And so that does make this an interesting conversation to participate in, of this relationship between the Catholic worker and the church. I joke, even though it's actually true, I hadn't heard of the Catholic worker until I founded one 9 years ago. In the first few years that Emmaus House existed, I wouldn't allow us to be called a Catholic worker because I wasn't sure what that meant or the connotations. It felt very strange coming from a Protestant background to be associated with anything called Catholic. Eventually enough people called us a Catholic worker that there's not much sense in not calling us one. So even though I'm not Catholic, I am a deeply spiritual person and feel like I've been drawn into the movement through what I believe is the leading of the Spirit, but also drawn right through this pursuit of love and finding what does it mean to love people more and more. So for me, though, there is always this very real question of what does it mean to be part of a movement that is Catholic in its name? I think that's something that every house has to figure out for themselves. So what does it mean to have the word Catholic for houses that don't have any practicing Catholics in them, or houses who are interacting with people for whom Catholicism just has been very painful? Or for people who aren't associated at all with any religion, what does it mean to be associated with the Catholic worker? What does that mean for the movement, and what does that mean practically for an individual? That word often, in Christianity in general, isn't exactly known for conjuring up welcoming thoughts. As we think about the Catholic worker needing to be a place of hospitality and a place of welcome, Catholicism and Christianity means something completely different. For women, it's a ban on ordination or an oppressive patriarchal system. For people like myself, it's a ban on being able to marry my fiance because she isn't a man. For others in our neighborhood, it brings back memories of the sexual abuse that occurred just a few decades ago in our local church. For Native Americans, it's the legacy of missions and boarding schools in support of forced deportation from their homelands. So we have all these harmful associations, right, with both Catholicism and Christianity, and yet we're all here today. So there's something that still draws us in. There's somehow, some way, even with all of that, we're all in houses or willingly associated with the movement still. And so I think it's those questions that, to me, we're trying to figure out here. So what do we do with this of holding both the horrible and yet sometimes beautiful legacy of the Catholic worker, of Catholicism, of Christianity, recognizing that those within our movement both identify that as a tradition and sometimes don't, and that those we interact with, those we find ourselves in community with, may or may not find it as something that connotes love or oppression. So I think I definitely come with more questions than answers. And not that I'm even necessarily hopeful that we will solve any of the questions that I'm coming with. But to me, I think it is helpful to be able to sit in that tension, or finding that there's both beauty and pain in the history of things. And it's the honest look at it that will help us learn how to move forward within the movement, maybe within our houses, or maybe just within our own individual understanding of what we're doing. So I think from here, we'll have space for Brian to share some about some of his views on Catholicism and the movement, a little bit of historically its attachment to it. And then from there, Matt will help us give us some prompts of moving into the breakout sessions to have a chance for us to discuss things before then moving back into a main group for debrief, as has been our custom. So Brian, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you, Lydia. That's a very good introduction on such short notice. I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I'm kind of frightened by it too, because this is not. It's impossible to give an objective, fact-based story here. And it's all reflected through ourselves. I live on a Catholic worker farm in Iowa for the last few decades, and I've been with the movement for a long time. When I met Dorothy Day, it was on my first day at the New York Catholic Worker in October 1975, and I was 19 years old then, and Dorothy was 78. And I was flattered and I was intimidated by her warm welcome, because she didn't treat me like the ignorant child that I was. I was treated like somebody who knew more than I knew, and more was expected from me than I thought was that I thought I could ever deliver. But I strongly suspect, looking back, that if I had told Dorothy that day that I'd come to the Catholic Worker to follow in her footsteps, and that I wanted to pattern my life and spirituality after hers, I would not have had the same warm welcome. In fact, I think I would have been on a bus home that day. Yep. Thank you, Dan. He was there too. Because this is not, and the topic of our talk is not the Catholic Worker, the Catholic Church and Dorothy Day, but the Catholic Church and the Catholic Worker, which is all of us. But I think we do need to look back at some of the history, especially because my personal feeling is that there are some misunderstandings about the movement's founders and the relationship they had with the church, and how the movement related to the church in early decades. There's an oversimplified perception, both in and outside the movement, that our founders were totally compliant and uncritical Catholics, and that everyone in the movement's early years was expected to be the same. The very first issue of the Catholic Worker, May 1st, 1933, listed 3 editors: Dorothy Day, Peter Morn, and John Day Jr. Now, John was Dorothy's beloved little brother. John was a communist. He was an atheist. He wasn't a Catholic, but he was a Catholic worker. He was an editor of the paper. So there was no faith test in the Catholic Worker from the beginning. And Lydia's presentation here is very, very apt. So 55 years later, in 1968, another Catholic Worker editor, Jack Cook, wrote in the paper this. He said, "The most profound criticism of the ecclesiastical establishment is the very existence of the Catholic Worker, in words and acts, past and present. Moreover, it says no by saying yes to unions, blacks, the unalterably poor, peace without victory, communities of service rather than service to itself and nation, love until it hurts. These early Christian radicals of the century, Dorothy Day and Peter Morn, went ahead and did their own thing, and those who follow them continue it. But neither were or are going to wait upon the establishment to catch them up." Now, scholars often note that Peter Morn's easy essays, Peter, the co-founder of the Worker with Dorothy, did not criticize the church, but this fact doesn't reflect Peter's reticence, but Dorothy's at the time. She wrote a letter to a priest who was supportive of the movement in 1934. She wrote, "I do indeed keep out some of this stuff that attacks the bishops. I just don't think it's politic. There are quite a number of priests who think Peter just quaint when Peter verbally attacks the clergy, who would, if we printed the stuff, hold up their hands in horror." Now, in later years, Dorothy matured as a Catholic and the movement was better established, and she was less concerned about being politic. And the paper was a form of criticism that had been censored from Peter's essays. While the paper published Ammon Hennessy's, quote, slighting remarks about Holy Mother Church, Dorothy wrote, there were some adverse comments among the staff, but also some severe criticism from our readers. Dorothy said that some of Ammon's comments were hurtful for her to hear, loving the church as she did, but the discourse was one that she insisted was not harmful, but was essential to the movement. Dorothy's own criticism of the institutional church sharpened too. In a 1970 interview with the National Catholic Reporter, Dorothy said, I feel that over and over again in history, the church has become so corrupt, it just cries to heaven for vengeance. The crisis is something terrific, she said. The crisis she attributed, quote, to the corruption in the institutional church through money and through their acceptance of the rotten, lousy system. Dorothy often spoke of her love and gratitude for the church, but even while she strove to find concordance rather than disagreement, especially in dealing with bishops and clergy, she could not help during a labor dispute between graveyard workers in the Archdiocese of New York, referred to the most awful war, awful of all wars, the war between the clergy and the laity. Often when Dorothy spoke of the Catholic hierarchy, she invoked scripture. In peace is my bitterness most bitter, she would say, and our enemies of our own household. But what is it about the church that Dorothy loved? I loved the church for Christ made visible, Dorothy wrote in her autobiography, The Long Loneliness, not for itself, because it was so often a scandal to me. Romano Guardini said, the church is the cross on which Christ is crucified, and one could not separate Christ from his cross. One must live in a state of permanent dissatisfaction with the church. I never expected much of the bishops, Dorothy wrote to Gordon Zahn in 1968. In all history, popes and bishops and abbots seem to have been blind and power-loving and greedy. I never expected leadership from them. It's the saints who keep appearing all through history, who keep things going. And what I expect is the bread of life. And down through the ages, there is that continuity. I think there's a misunderstanding about how the Catholic worker in times past related to the institutional church. A friend from a house in the House of Hospitality here in the Midwest that's very much a part of the movement, but doesn't choose to identify as a Catholic worker, suggested to me that past Catholic workers' closer connection to institutional Catholicism has meant that older generations of Catholic workers have been less tied to wage labor and more easily able to live off donations, spend long periods of time in jail, etc. But then as now, though, the CW communities with, quote, closer connections to institutional Catholicism tend not to be the ones doing serious resistance. And the church institutions that support the works of mercy are often not the ones that are going to be that will be supporting works of mercy, but not so keen on the Catholic worker opposing war and overthrowing capitalism. Now, in the 80s, I was at the Catholic Worker House in Davenport, and along with the Rock Island, Illinois Catholic worker, we had a constant presence protesting at the area's largest employer, which was the Rock Island Arsenal, the military industrial complex in our area. The Davenport Diocese, with whom we personally had very, very warm relationships, had a stock letter that they sent to people who complained about us, disavowing any knowledge of our actions and assuring that despite our name, we received no institutional church money. We also had parishes tell us, stop getting arrested if you expect any donations from us. I actually think that it's when Catholic worker houses, communities act and speak as Catholics, that our relationship with the institution is particularly strained. From the Gravediggers strike in 1949 to the Worcester Catholic Workers' Support of Nurses in a labor dispute with Catholic Hospital, it's when lay Catholics dare to confront the institutions with Catholic teachings, the relationships get fraught. In several different cities, I've been with Catholic workers chased off the steps of churches and was once arrested on the campus of a Catholic university attempting to bring the gospel where it was not wanted. Right after the war in Iraq started, some of us in Iowa, Frank, who's on this Zoom, was with us. We visited Bishop Sharon, the Bishop of Des Moines, to talk about the war, and he had been silent on the war except to express his support for the troops. And in our conversation, he admitted that the Pope himself had declared the war with Iraq unjust, immoral, and illegal. He also said that he felt it was pastorally unhelpful for Catholics to actively oppose the war. In 2016, I was summoned by the Archdiocesan Tribunal investigating the sanctity of Dorothy Day. And one question seemed to be of paramount importance. I was asked if the example of Dorothy and the Catholic worker enhanced the repute of the Catholic Church. And I answered definitely yes. And I spoke of many people I know who would be predisposed by their own hard experiences to despise the church. These have been guests in our houses. They've been people that we've marched with in the streets, people we've gone to jail with, for whom Dorothy and the Catholic worker are the only redeeming factors of the church. In Kate Hennessy's great book, The World Would Be Saved by Beauty, about her mother and grandmother, Tamar and Dorothy, she has a line that poses a question that has really haunted me. Kate was a practicing Catholic as an adult only in the years that she was active with the Catholic worker. And she wrote, "I turned away from the Catholic worker and I turned away from the church. For without the Catholic worker, the Catholic Church made no sense to me." Many of in the CW who are Catholics can only make sense of it through the CW. I have one good friend who lived with us here on the farm and lived at other Catholic worker houses in the US and in the UK for years. And she lived with a community of vowed sisters for a while and was contemplating joining them. She was a cradle Catholic. But when she came to the point where she decided she was not going to be a nun and she wasn't going to be a Catholic worker, she joined the Quakers because the parochial life of a Catholic in the pew on Sunday just had no appeal. Dorothy's own experience as a young convert before the Catholic worker, a very painful time for her. She believed that joining the church was the right thing to do, joining the church with her daughter. But she wrote in her autobiography, "I felt no particular joy in partaking of these three sacraments. I proceeded about my own active participation in them grimly, coldly, making acts of faith, certainly with no consolation whatever. It's only when she met Peter Morin and formed a community with the poor dispossessed did being a Catholic really make sense even to Dorothy." It was, quote, "the saints that keep appearing all through history and the bread of life down through the ages. Christ made visible, not the institution, which was a cross that was so often a scandal to her, that Dorothy found refuge and consolation. And it is this that sustains us today. Even as she could not separate herself from the church that is Christ's cross, she was committed to a life of permanent dissatisfaction with it." As always, but especially in these very different times, as individuals and communities, we need to discern our place and relationship with the institutional church. And as always, there's room for all of us and we need each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, so much good stuff to chew on. Just a logistical note, River Sims, I muted your phone call a little bit ago. In order to unmute yourself, if you push *6, you'll be able to speak in your breakout rooms in a moment. But just to give us a little prep before we go there, As we have acknowledged already, many of us have a personal history with the institutional church, with its tradition, with its core beliefs, with the people within the church, and with the scripture that directs her. These have shaped us, our individual experiences and feelings and connections to Catholicism. And as was said, we recognize that our Catholic worker communities have their own experiences of and commitments to the institutional church, the people within the church, the tradition, and so on. As we prepare to go to breakout rooms, we do so holding our individual and community perspectives and so much more. We recognize that we will enter space with folks who might have had vastly different experiences, who center different things, and who have different hopes for what becomes of the connections between the worker and the Catholic Church. As we share space together, we are invited to refuse anything that distorts the sacredness and dignity of each other, people made in God's image. We commit to moving with tenderness and openness and curiosity as we listen to what it is like to be someone else. We remain open to challenging our assumptions, to exploring how our identities and privileges move in the world, and things that will hopefully move us to a more fuller exploration of all of this, where we can create a space that speaks our truths and where all are heard and valued. I know for myself, my aim is to be part of building the best version of myself so that I can be a part of creating a Catholic worker space focused on dignity and liberation and healing and sacred community, things which I believe are at the root of my Catholic core and the Catholic core, things I draw from and connect to, but I know is not everyone's experiences. As Lydia mentioned, these discussions will bring up a lot of things because our experiences hold both the beautiful and the broken. There will be a separate breakout room. So again, if anyone while in your room would like a space to just step away from the conversation that's happening, in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen is a button that says either leave or end, and you'll just want to return to the main room, and I'll direct you to the space that Lydia is holding down. But now to the specifics of the breakout room. In our small groups today, we are going to invite each of you to take anywhere from 4 to 6 minutes, depending on if you have 4 to 5 or 6 people in your room, to answer this question. What do you hope might be the future relationship of the Catholic worker movement to the church? And then after everyone has shared, we're going to invite your group to spend about 10 minutes reflecting on the multitude of positions offered and to come up with 3 core questions that you believe individuals and communities need to explore and reckon with as they consider how they relate to the Catholic Church. When we come back to the large room, we're going to share back those questions, and so that everyone has a chance to think of what are the questions that we might engage individually and in our communities to best be able to do this work and to honor the many experiences that come here. So when you get into your breakout room, we ask that someone volunteer to jot down those questions when they're shared, and that you all can come up with together. And we also ask that someone just be mindful of the time. Time can get away from us, and we have surely not given you enough time to dive into the richness that's there. So please make sure that everyone has a chance to speak. Make sure folks are able to be heard and to share the things that come up for them. I'm going to drop into the chat those 2 questions. The first one being the first go round, the second one being the brainstorm. And we will invite you to spend, should we be in groups for 35 minutes, 24, 25 of which being a chance for everyone to share, and then 10 minutes for folks to throw out questions that would help the Catholic worker really reckon and consider its relationship with the Catholic Church so that the dignity of all is cared for. So I'm going to send you to breakout rooms now. If you need anything, again, feel free to return to the main room. We look forward to seeing you all in 35 minutes. Take care. So that is all of us. Sorry for those of you who are in small groups. A couple folks headed out right as we were heading to breakouts. So hopefully you had some nice, lovely conversations with your group, however large or small. There are 8 groups. So I'm going to read the group names out, and we're going to invite folks to take just a couple minutes to share what were the questions that came up for your group that you'd want your whole community to consider, to chew on, to wrestle with, so that we can continue to move forward with the integrity we're committed to as a movement. So the first group was Brian, Joan, and Steve. So if one of you all want to start us off, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, I guess we were talking about the interrelationship among the members of the group, basically. And some of the things that in a Catholic worker group you would want to consider was ecumenical dialogue, realizing that a lot of people come from very different traditions and you wanted to be respectful and make that a positive note in informing people. The second one was opportunities for respectful, nonviolent dissent. That when things are coming up, and I guess when people do get upset, I suppose it's very important to just try to calm the emotion down so that you don't say something that you regret later, and that would be a scene. And the third one is relationships based on humility. And also, Steve brought up the question of this would be more with people who could see from the outside, I would say, not the inner workings of the group, but basically using or reflecting the principles of faith as the basis for this reaching out and community and everything like that. Probably all the people within the house know this, but if you're doing something that would come out in a public forum, that it would be, I think, helpful. And he thought too that the principles upon which Dorothy, the spiritual principles, should be referred to. So.
Thank you so much, Joan. And team. Group 2 was the LACW folks, Harry and Lincoln. If any of you want to share back.
Oh boy, okay. Hello. So these are the questions that we came up with. How to expand the Catholic worker, and that meant not, just how can we make it bigger, but by also including people of different faiths. How to maintain the works of mercy as central to the Catholic worker.
Mm-hmm.
And what does it look like for your community to be a source of renewal and resistance within the Catholic Church? Those were our 3 questions.
All right. Thank you very much for sharing them. And at the end, we'll probably have a chance for some more reflections and share back. So thank you.
Okay.
Group 3, we had Alice, Dave, and Faith.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yeah, we discussed first of all, what we want our relationship between the church. We want the church to be, in Alice's word, more awesome. We want to be welcoming and inclusive of all faiths and pastoral practices. And then we want to we want to challenge them on what is the Catholic identity. The 3 questions we came up with are we afraid of losing support, or are we softening our message in order to avoid conflict? Secondly, what are we doing to reform the church? And third, what does the Catholic identity keep us from empowering and uplifting everyone? So those are the questions we're asking of ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you all. Appreciate those questions and thoughts. Our next room was Daniel, Leah, Nick, and Paul.
Okay, I was the I was the caretaker here. The first question we had was, how do we create both a synthesis and balance between the body and spirit? How do we do the lived work, the mutual aid that Kropotkin talks about, but also how do we embody somehow the missionary priest? This came from a quote that Nick brought out from Dorothy Day. So just sort of really recognizing that there's these two elements and that how do we not lose the spiritual in the practical work of the works of mercy? The second question is, how are we acting and organizing to try to transform dominant institutions like the church? What are the practices we have? And the third, which kind of feels like a lot of what has been said, but to really be authentic about who we are and where we are, and ask ourselves, what do our lives say about the richness of the tradition, both to the church and to those who we are in relationship with, and how do we do that in an authentic way?
Beautiful. Thank you all for those questions. Just as a reminder, we will send them out to folks. So if you're scribbling them down, don't worry about it. Room 5 was one of our small rooms. Isaiah and Joanne.
Sure. So I was appointed the sharer of our questions. So we had a lovely conversation. We were together for 35 minutes, just the two of us. So that was actually really nice. I wasn't expecting that. So we had a really wide-ranging conversation, but 3 questions that we sort of landed with are, how do we salvage from Catholicism spiritual resources, theological resources, whatever, that are still important? Is there treasure within the tradition that would still fund the work that we're doing? The second thing is, how do we distance ourselves as a movement from the harms that have and continue to be perpetuated by institutional Catholicism? And finally, as a related question, what sort of duty do we have as a movement for reparations work within that? So not only how do we distance ourselves from the harm, but how do we take responsibility for our complicity in the system and to do good reparations work?
Beautiful. Thank you too. I'm glad you had a good conversation. Room 6, excuse me, Kim and Steve, Martha, Hennessy, and Megan.
I took some notes. So regarding the question, several good ideas. What do you hope might be the future relationship of the Catholic worker to the Catholic Church? Megan had an answer. She hoped that the Catholic work would be an inspiration to the institutional church. And an example she gave was that, maybe someday through relationships with a Catholic worker community, that ordinary parishes or parishioners could open Christ rooms in their homes. Martha would like to hear more from the pulpit about the 2 existential threats to life, like nuclear weapons and climate change. But then Martha also said that this message has the laity, that the clergy has too much to lose, and keeps hoping that there will be priests and bishops willing to step up to be crucified. And Steve reminded us that at best, he feels the Catholic worker role is the prophetic stance. That the Catholic worker tells the church what reality is for the poor and what reality is for the message of Jesus. Dealing with our core questions. One question that we mentioned we should be asking among ourselves in our communities is, from the gospel today, who do you say that I am? who do we say that Jesus is? Then another question is, what is the history of the Catholic Church, the institutional church in our own communities? Can we look at that and make it part of our own story? Such as the LA worker right now is responding to the 250th anniversary, if I've got the number right, of the Catholic Church coming to California and what that all meant for Native people. We in other areas of the country, we could have a similar situation that would need to be addressed. And so I guess that would be looking at how can we look at harms that have been caused by our institutional church. But then also a question was posed, how can we be a force for healing the harms committed by this institutional church whose names we claim? Which, so the broader harms, to bigger groups, and in the very individual harms, to particular women, particular LGBT people, to particular children. So those were three of the questions. We had many questions actually that came up, but those were three that I wrote down.
Well, thank you. And would definitely love to see some of those other ones later. Room 7, Shelley, Tenzi, Dennis, and Theo.
We didn't designate somebody. We only came up with 2 questions and I wrote them down, so I will share those if that's okay.
Please.
And other people can jump in. We had quite a long talk, and the 2 questions. The first one was the idea: how do Catholic workers remain faithful to being Catholic workers when material questions arise, which has to do with if we have a closer relationship with the institutional church, does that include finances? And if it does that make us water down our messages and our belief? And how, if we were to have such a closer relationship, how would that look? And what would we need to be cautious about? So that was one cluster. And another one is, how do we navigate being both Catholic and inclusive, and the value of diversity? And the Catholic Church tends to draw lines of exclusion. And how do we, if we are going to become closer to the church, the institutional church, how do we deal with that? Those were 2 of our questions. Anybody want to add anything? That's it then.
Thank you all so much. In our last group, Dan, Paul, and Rosalie.
Well, like the rest of you, we had a very spirited conversation, but we did get down to our 3 questions, and one was formulated by each one of us. So I hope I do this justice. But Rosalie, her question more was to do with how should individual Catholic worker communities justify the use of the word Catholic worker when so many of their members aren't Catholic? That was her question. Paul, what can the Catholic worker do to become more accepted in the church today? My question is, how can the Catholic worker contribute to the transformation of the priesthood, wherein communities pick their own priests, men, women, divorced people, transgender people, pick them for their qualifications and for the period of time that they choose, rather than relying on what will still soon be an extinct Elks Club. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Group 8. And as I think we can all see from the questions that have been framed, we cover a wide spectrum of thoughts and feelings and experiences. And as a group of folks committed to a similar collective project, an important opportunity for us to chew on these and to see what they mean for us in our own individual lives and in our work. It's 2:25, so we are nearing the end, but I did want to create a space just for a minute or two. If anyone feels like there was not a question not named that feels important to add to the conversation, or a point worth just offering, we will take just a minute or two, so please keep it short, but wanted to offer just a brief space for anything that felt unsaid.
I'd like to say one thing. I sense this a lot. I think there's a failure often on our parts to distinguish the fact that the Roman Catholic Church may be the church of some of us. That is one thing, and the Catholic worker makes up our communities, you know. I know they're closely bound, but they're two separate issues.
Thank you.
Our community works with people in recovery, and so we teach and most people aren't Catholic, so we use the 12 principles of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is applied Catholicism, reconciliation, prayer, and service to others as the focal point for conversations. But I also think that the two things were important to Dorothy. I don't think she was, I don't think it's much example of her trying to reform the Catholic Church. She was interested in peace and social justice issues, certainly. We started 16 years ago, we started asking professors on 186 Catholic university campuses to donate a lecture focused through the lens of Catholic social teaching. And I think Catholic social teaching was very important to Dorothy. The principles, not the politics. And it's been interesting in this outreach, we're asking people to think through their vocation, their profession through the lens of Catholic social teaching principles. And I go to Mass every day. Not everybody in our we've got 4 sober houses, 27 people, and I think I'm the only Catholic at present. But everybody's looking at me to see if I walk like I talk. And the only way I can do that, the only way I can keep my composure is to, I go to Mass every day. That's where I find my peace. I don't get involved in the politics of the church. Although I have written some nonviolent dissents to our bishop. I don't find that's where the fruit of our ministry is here in Dayton, Ohio. It's I find the Catholic universities and the religious orders are a great source of inspiration.
Appreciate that, Stephen. And I think what you've offered us is, what allows us to do the best, most integrous work that we can, in a way reflecting the deepest values we hold. And what a gift we get to learn those both on our own in our own journeys, but also in community. It's 2:29. I want to respect people's time today. This room will be kept open for another 30 minutes. If folks would like to dive in more and share more, we'd love to have you. But just as some closing reminders, our next talk will be October 10th, racial justice and reparations. in the Catholic Church. And so just wanting to name too that, sorry that the email came out late. Thank you so much to Lydia and Brian for your sharing and framing today. I will make sure to be more on top of the email moving forward. We also want to make sure that we continue to expand the invitations to this space. So if you know anyone who's not here, please reach out, invite them in, and we will do our best to reach out to more folks as well. And yeah, thank you for making time today. Thank you for sitting with this complex, but so important a conversation. And if you'd like to continue it, feel free to stick around. Otherwise, feel free to unmute yourself and to say your goodbyes to folks. But have a lovely day.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Peace. Be well.